Товарищи!
Cuba's journey to capitalism was a complicated process, one that proved the difficulty of changing social relations. As how all changes made, contradictions were ever apparent. A contradiction of commodities: tobacco, a rich poison, and sugar, a sweet food. Yet that sweet commodity was a product of the most brutality. Not to say tobacco was an innocently made product, but its process was quite suave. Tobacco here represents the chains of development, chains of feudal and colonial superstructures that hindered bourgeoisie development, that which came with some sense of moralism, and at the very least, guilty, limited exploitation. If then, sugar represents the relentless exploitation that superseded the chains of development, authority, and ideology. This is to say, sugar seriously accelerated the natural processes of class society. The seeds of the rising bourgeois revolutionary consciousness germinated during Havana's English occupation. But before exploring that, we must understand the conditions before. The age of colonialist attention to tobacco. The age of church-sponsored monopoly before the heathenous sugar oligarchy.
Pobrecitos míos, no os asustéis, porque sean muchas las penalidades que tengáis que sufrir como esclavos. Esclavo podrá ser vuestro cuerpo, pero libre tenéis vuestra alma para volar un día a la feliz mansión de los escogidos. No os olvidéis, para llegar al paraíso preciso es pasar por el Calvario, llorar y gemir. Tal es nuestro destino, la suerte de los discípulos de Jesús.
The Caribbean was the first chapter of colonial domination. Being relatively small islands, their indigenous were extremely vulnerable. Most Caribbean islands were totally exterminated of their indigenous without attempt of assimilation. Though Cuba had the advantage of being one of the larger islands in the region, paired with its thick tropical environment, leaving some of the more rural areas preserved. The Caribbean's situation had led it being used as an experimental region for colonial domination in the Americas as a whole. Cuba was dominated by the Spanish crown. It was originally treated as a secondary colony and a pit stop for naval ships. In the 18th century, Cadiz and Seville were royal monopoly ports. They were Spanish choke points to keep Cuba under colonial mercantilism. Mercantilism is capitalism's predecessor, sometimes described as literally the same thing, but in reality, and theoretically, pretty different. Not as different as feudalism or capitalism, but there is still a worthy distinction. It's a transitional stage of primitive private accumulation under state monopoly. Capitalism can be reduced to the private, endless, industrial, and supposedly free ability to accumulate surplus, that surplus being the product of the wage relation that commodifies labor. Cuban peasants and merchants were legally required to sell their products, often primary products, to Cadiz middlemen, so they could be sold to the Spanish metropolis. The exchange between the Cubans to the royalty was taxed multiple times through the supply line. The Cadiz merchants brought secondary products from the metropole to be sold back to the Cubans, also with a tax. This stagnated growth in bourgeois consciousness. Though, like a cockroach, you can never fully kill the bourgeois spirit. Merchants smuggled British, French, and Dutch goods and slaves, creating illicit trade routes, which would be important to their future development. If it isn't clear, class power was held in the colonial state and its select few merchants. Class positions were rigid. A small group of Spanish administrators and merchants held all the power while oppressing the rest. In sum, colonial mercantilism can be characterized by its remote extraction of surplus. The metropolis expropriated surplus through rent, taxes, and supply line control. The church, Cuba's feudalist authority, defended the state apparatus and participated in this remote extraction through tithes. Tithes are religious taxes tied to land and production. starting at about 10% of agricultural productions, as well as a land-owning institution, owning 10 to 15% of all land pre-English occupation. The church was also deeply vetted in the interests of cadis and Seville ports. 1, their authority was backed by the crown, and 2, they shared bureaucratic networks. The church was a monopoly of its own, harnessing the moral and fiscal market of the countryside. The tithe meant the church controlled the temple of accumulation. They used monopoly of cultural capital to reinforce mercantilism and promote colonialism. With moralistic values, they often hid the brutality of slavery, explaining it as a necessary function of the Catholicizing process. The law of the Indies, the good government decrees, stated that Sunday and Saints' Day, attendance at Mass, baptism, religious indoctrination, confession, communion, confirmation, church marriage, and burial in consecrated ground were obligatory for slaves. The church unknowingly planted the first seeds of its destruction. The church sponsored the first sugar mills, as they were founded under the guise of protecting saints, with names of Santa Maria, San Antonio, San Nicolas, and more. The earliest and the most noble members of the sugar oligarchy, which for now we will call the sugarcrats, used the institution for class reproduction. As Frankel says, they formed one family in the feudal sense of the word, carefully forging links with each other, economically calculating each marriage so that the accumulated fortunes would not be dispersed, and hereditary offices will remain within the original nucleus. Still, the church seemingly was a more difficult superstructure to shake off. It was shown to survive the shifting in mercantilism production, and it continuously hindered bourgeois dominance. But it was more so a long-drawn breath of failure that began with the rise of the proto-bourgeois in 1762.
Dale la mano, toitos son manitos. Dale la mano, toitos son manitos. Dale la mano, toitos son manitos. Dale la mano, dale la mano.
In 1762, the English invaded and occupied Havana for around 11 months, ending with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. They stumbled upon 100 relatively small sugar mills that produced around 5.75 million kg, or kilograms, of sugar per year. Granted, before I'm accused of portraying the English as some civilizing force, recognize these facts. The Spanish were quite behind in their ventures toward capital and industrialization. Meanwhile, Britain was an industrial and capitalist powerhouse. The Creole, Cuban-born Spanish elite, had been taking aggressive initiatives long before the English invasion, with 89 mills in 1759, then 93 mills just a year later, 98 mills a year after that, and after occupation, 106 mills. Keep in mind, the sugarcrats at this time were tethered to Cadiz merchants, thus limited. The British only accelerated a natural process that was in the making by delegitimizing the Cadiz and legitimizing the previous illegal trade routes. The English had also reinforced the sugarocracy by throwing them into a capitalist world market. It had also been of tremendous importance that the price of sugar was so high, being, in 1760, 16 reals for around 11.5 kilograms of white sugar. This high profit margin allowed for easy reinvestment, so the sugarcrat expanded production. The English also benefited heavily from the quick rise of this venture, accelerating England's industrial growth. Cuba quickly became a highly profitable asset of theirs. You may ask, if it was so valuable, why would they give it back to Spain? The truth is, a mix of desperate war fatigue, logistics, and imperialist logic. Ultimately, the English accelerated the historical process in Cuba and got what they needed for them: Cuba in the capitalist world market. Then Cuba was traded with Florida, allowing Britain to stay within the triangular trade and benefit indirectly from Cuba. Finally, the military efforts to protect the island from other colonial powers and from slaves was far too much for their own interests. Typically, colonies had capitalism imposed upon itself by the metropolis, lagging with the development of the more industrially progressive metropolis. But, so far, Cuba presents a history of initially aggressive but suppressed bourgeois tendency, one that was only brought to center stage by a liberalizing force, which then, in turn, helped such a force develop further. When the Spanish reacquired Cuba, it was far more productively advanced than its feudal oppressor. If anything, Cuba, as a colony, dragged Spain, a decaying feudalist empire, into capitalist production. Now to address the elephant in the room. Commodities aren't produced out of thin air. The entire work structure was radically transformed when in contact with the capitalist market. The English imported slaves in those 11 months than what would have normally taken 10 to 15 years, introducing roughly 10,000 hands into sugar production, changing to what was before a personal slave-master dynamic to produce a set amount of usefulness, to an impersonal object of producing infinite surplus. This also meant that the sugar mill had to expand size, as it was much more easier to do than building a new sugar mill, due to the lack of social and physical infrastructure. This also explains why the quantity of sugar mills only increased by 8 during the years it gained the most labor power, and also being its most productive year. Another shifting dynamic was that before, sugar mills were autonomous. Slaves planted and harvested their own food, ate other food like meat that was produced on the farm, as well as lived in their own shacks on the estate. With the boost in bodies of labor came the fact that there were more faces to feed, and one farm could not sustain so many. It was much simpler, and more importantly, much cheaper to import food from the countryside. The food was typically carried by mules. What we see developing here is not sugar developing as a sole commodity, but rather a complex depending on slaves, food, and mules. The sugar cut managed to keep sugar prices at a steady level, roughly the same as the previously mentioned, for about 60 years, and production steadily increased. That is, until the 1790s. There could not have been a historical resolution as beautiful to the Creole as the Haitian Revolution. Fringles puts it perfectly as, with the Haitian collapse, the economic objective was attained. Cuba became the world's top producer of sugar, the new devourer of slaves.
Mucho antes y después que Suárez Romero escribiera su novela, una ola de levantamientos estremecía las haciendas de la isla. 1812. Levantamientos en los ingenios de Puerto Príncipe, Holguín, Bayamo, Trinidad y La Habana, capitaneados por el negro libre José Antonio Aponte. 1825. Rebelión en ingenios y potreros de Matanzas, con un saldo de 24 fincas saqueadas y quemadas, 15 blancos y 43 negros muertos. 1830. Sublevación del cafetal Ascensión en Tapaste y en el Guajay. 1835. Levantamiento en el ingenio Carolina y el cafetal Burato. 1837. Insurrección en Manzanillo y varios ingenios de Trinidad. 1842. Se levantan el ingenio Loreto en Managua y el cafetal Perseverancia en Lagunillas. 1843. Enero 27 y 28. Alzamiento del ingenio La Alcancía, que arrastró tras sí a los ingenios La Luisa, La Trinidad, Las Nieves, La Aurora, los negros del cafetal Moscú, del potrero Ranchuelo y los constructores del ferrocarril Cárdenas Jaruco. Noviembre 5 del mismo año, alzamiento del ingenio Triunvirato en Matanzas, que arrastró a los esclavos del Ácana, La Concepción, San Miguel, San Lorenzo y San Rafael.
Haiti's revolution left a massive power vacuum in the global market, especially when referring to slaves and sugar. The price of white sugar goes to 40 real per 11.5 kilograms, while returning to normal levels at the end of the century, 16 real. This gave great opportunity for the sugarcrat to reinvest and caught the eye of many U.S. plutocrats, Creole opportunists, mestizo merchants, and the most pundit investors, exiled Haitian sugarmen. At this point, Cuba had developed 237 sugar mills, producing 13.8 million kilograms of sugar per year. In the next 14 years, sugar mills nearly doubled, ending with 416 sugar mills in 1806, and producing 56.5 million kilograms of sugar per year. The massive ratio between sugar mills and production in 1792 and 1806 is partly, and more relevantly, I will explain on this later, because Cuba absorbed Haiti's intellectual prospects, like the machinery, technicians, and professional slave managers, while also absorbing the slave trade gap. The Haitian Revolution changed the world, creating a new phenomena: second slavery. First slavery took place in the Caribbean and southern USA, characterized by its mercantilist context. But really, second slavery is a historical perspective rooted in historical fact that rejects the idea that slavery was an outdated in the global capitalist system and liberal hegemony. Slavery was simply not the same as it was in the 16th and 18th century than it was in the 18th to 19th century. This historical process started in Cuba particularly early with the English accelerated import of slaves. But really, that was nothing compared to the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution. In 1792, Cuba had 88,000 enslaved Africans. Just 25 years later, they had 225,000. But it's not just a quantitative difference. It's a difference in function. First slavery had a finite goal. Second slavery has a goal of limitless surplus. Capital wants to reproduce itself, even through non-capitalist manners, if it has to. Rosa Luxemburg named this the non-capitalist environment, which she also states: accumulation of capital, seen as a historical process, employs force as a permanent weapon, not only at its genesis, but further each day. In this sense, the process of primitive accumulation is an essential part of capitalist accumulation in the historical epoch. Slavery offers primary and secondary products to the metropolis, where they then can increase their own production through indirect and direct means. The Caribbean generally holds a special place in this process, as their tropical rich soil creates the perfect crops, what is known as the proletarian hunger killers. By the 17th century in England, sugar had become a household commodity, known for its substituting full meals and giving quick bursts of energy. It was certainly helpful during the workday. Combine this with coffee and tobacco's stimulant properties, and you will have the ability to conquer anything at the workplace. The trifecta was so efficient. It was even part of some slave rations. This is just one, at least interesting, example of non-capitalist environments. Finally, second slavery is also distinctive in the way that slaves were managed. Not only because the impersonal relations due to over 200 being to a sugar mill, but the undeniable fear of another slave revolt. Ada Farrar in Freedom's Mirror says, even though no slave rebellion in Cuba came close to assuming the proportions of the Haitian example, it is clear that the Haitian Revolution and Haiti itself, after 1804, became part of the cognitive world of the enslaved. Masters thought about Saint-Domingue, interpreting the everyday actions of their bondspeople in light of what they knew, or what they thought they knew, about the Haitian Revolution. And as the revolution changed the demographic and economic profile of the Spanish colony, it shaped the way colonial authorities governed, given what they call the novel character that distinguished the present epoch from all previous ones. The sugar cuts started by changing the layout of the plantation. The sugar mill became home base for the overseers for wide and far viewing. Fields, roads, and buildings were laid in such a way so the overseer could see all at once. The previous shacks were turned into giant barracks with armed guards at night. Then came the regular use of corporal punishment and solitary confinement. The idea was to force the slave into complete submission without an ounce of leeway. The sugarcrat, without much convincing, had the crown create militias to patrol the rural side in search of escaped slaves. If they did find a group, they would use their surveillance network to find the ringleader and have them executed. The surveillance network consisted of spies or free black men posing as slaves. The proto-bourgeois have rejected the church, and with it, old morality. With no ideals to replace them, these men are dogs, and still unworthy of the title that is, the bourgeoisie. Granted, their intellectual ventures had only just begun.
Bueno, si le damos una buena educación religiosa y hacemos que asistan a misa los domingos y días festivos, podemos dominar lo que hay de salvaje en ellos y salvar lo que hay de humano.
Bueno, pero es que eso de llevar a toda la dotación a la parroquia resulta una Una pérdida enorme, padre. Un día de trabajo, casi.
Pérdida sería verlos vivir sin temor a Dios, como salvajes, sin mujeres, entregados al pecado, al onanismo, a la sodomia.
Vamos, padre, no hay que exagerar.
The church was an obvious obstacle to the sugarcrat. The absurdity of a religious tax was not dealt with in action. Compromise after compromise brought the sugarocracy closer to its goal, maximizing profit. The feudal privilege was protested for years, and honestly, rightfully so. The tithe was 5% of all production, making it the highest in the Americas. That being said, it was also one of the few taxes that was paid consistently. That is, until they had the confidence to take over the church once and for all. Starting in the 1790s, sugarcrats began refusing to pay the tithes. While not collective and organized, it was still a major scare for the church. In 1796, it was even scarier when the Real Consulado, an institution founded and made for the sugarocracy, requested to the king that new sugar mills are not to pay tithes. The king handed the responsibility to the Bishop of Havana, which then, in a very unprofessional manner, the bishop dodged a single interview with the Real Consulado for 8 years. During that time, the sugarcrat disobedience grew. The tithe strike, which I use loosely, resulted in the church demanding accounting books to be shown. Obviously, the sugarcrat did not comply. The Creoles, impatient with the bishop's games, bypassed him by bribing other colonial officials, obtaining a royal decree that newly built mills are exempt from tithes, and old mills shall pay a fixed amount based on 1804 production numbers. We again see here the sugarcrat's ability to accelerate the resolution of feudal mercantilist contradictions. Of course, this is not of some special ability, but due to the base rapidly transforming. The early sugarcrat adopted bourgeois terminology. Swallowed by the fantasies of themselves, they believed themselves to be on par with the English bourgeoisie. Not to deny that there are similarities between the Creoles and the English, but to acknowledge the fact that the sugarcrats were nothing but slave owners participating in a global market. Sugar production was still primitive, expanding through quantitative tendencies rather than developing through its qualities. The sugarocracy knew this. Despite their contradictory self-perception, they knew they needed to industrialize and abandon mercantilist social relations, though much easier said than done. While the rest of the English Antilles had their technology handed down to them from the metropolis, the Creoles were much more productively advanced than their metropolis. They had the resources to produce sugar, but they needed intellectuals to maximize it. So they began to search the industrial world for techniques and technology. These steps, while still not quite there, bring them closer to the role of the bourgeoisie. We see this transitional stage of a class with global relations and interdependence, but still stuck in a Spanish feudal system enslaved society. Another important landmark was the introduction of the steam engines in Cuba. Creoles began to import the steam engine in the 1790s, beating the majority of Latin America. To incorporate into the sugar mill itself was another problem of its own. So it was initially used for water pumping, irrigating the sugarcane. They were only used in the biggest and most profitable plantations, and it would stay this way until roughly the 1860s. The biggest intellectual obstacle to sugar production was the Creoles' attachment to slavery. It stagnated their industrialization for decades, even if they understood how to. To be perfectly fair, Cuba's material conditions could not have supported such a breakup. There was simply not enough free labor to compensate for a slave replacement. Sugar mills had already absorbed the peasants due to an offered wage of 3 reals per 907 kilograms of sugarcane cut, a wage that was superior to years of work for a peasant. After the end of the 18th century, there was already an established mixture of a slave worker and a wage worker. Arango, a political pundit, intellectual, and spokesperson for the sugarcrats, saw the problem clearly. The slave trade gave power to the merchants. The sugarcrats depended on the slave merchant for labor, but the merchant did not need the sugarcrat. Merchant power was vested in most forms of the mercantilist superstructure. In other words, the sugarcrat grew incredibly rich but still politically docile. And everybody agreed that industrialization of the sugar mill was impossible with slave labor. Pedro de Ego, a key theorizer in developing Cuba's labor relations, said, slavery, runs counter to the simplicity and practicality which our sugar trains require. Fringles adds that simplicity and practicality are euphemisms for brutality and monotony. So in turn, the first element of industrialization across sugar production was not within the mill, but the railroads and the streets. A great obstacle to the mass-scale sugar production were the roads. Millions of tons of sugar could not be moved through dirt paths, which often got washed away with rain or overgrown with weeds. The railroad was incredibly successful, cutting transportation costs by 70%. The difference here, and at this time, between the steam engine and the roads, is that the railroad and paved road transformed the means of production entirely, while the steam engine was only for a select few plantations. As well as the profound societal implications, Cuba was now united. In the context of bourgeois intellectualism, unity allowed for the communication of ideas to occur easier. While setting up the means for industrialization, it also reinforced contradiction. The generous surplus now available allowed the sugarocracy to expand, which then they needed more slave labor.
El pitch inglés Fawcett Preston Company trabaja acoplado de una máquina de vapor de 12 caballos de fuerza. Las tres masas de hierro horizontales permiten una mejor distribución de la caña y evitan una serie de mutilaciones de manos y brazos muy frecuentes entre los negros. The demonstration, please. Es fuerte y resistente al trato de los esclavos y logra extraer el 65% del guarapo contenido en la caña. Muele en solo 12 horas lo que antes en 24 uno movido por bueyes.
If intellectual prowess was the first part of industrialization, the second part would be second slavery, specifically industrial slavery. What was agreed to not be able to happen actually happened. Mechanization with slaves. Between 1838 and 80, the Cuban sugar industry became the most mechanized in the world, finally integrating the steam engine into the sugar mill. Pedro de Ego was proved embarrassingly wrong. Slaves were trained to become artisans by a crew of skilled wage workers, often making up tiny fractions of labor power on a plantation. Though this meant the Creole's slave dependence was enriched. By 1860, slaves made up 1/3 of the population of Cuba, and sugar became 4/5 of Cuba's exports. Essentially, the forces of production expanded, even though the relations of production remained slave-based. Make no mistake, productivity drastically improved, and thus, profits, contradictions were at its highest. Knight notes that most Cuban planters acknowledge, at least in theory, that slavery could not continue indefinitely, and that free labor would eventually become the appropriate basis. Their current success was frankly a lucky development that had everything to do with the global demand of sugar and the Haitian Revolution. I cannot speak to the extent the sugarcrats were aware of this, but they were aware that if they didn't adopt a capitalist base, they would fall behind. The dependency on slaves only grew, even though the sugar mill was developing qualitatively now. The increasing production required more slaves for harvesting the raw materials, which meant sugar mills were still growing quantitatively, requiring more land, which was getting strained. The Creoles were also still under the thumb of the merchants, who held even more power over them since the slave trade was declared illegal in 1867 by Spain. Along with the pressures of U.S. abolitionists and the British, the price of a slave skyrocketed. Marx described this as the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, as inherent to capitalism too, but slave labor dependency only exacerbated this tendency for its systemic lack of flexibility. Slavery also restrained the sugarcrat by closing off consumer markets. Without a wage, 1/3 of Cuba was instantly barred from buying products. All this to say, things were working well for the sugarocracy, but there was a sense of fragility felt across the board. The sugarcrats prepared as much as they could. First, in 1847, by importing over 125,000 Chinese free workers, also known as coolies. They were employed with 8-year contracts to work in some way with the sugar complex, mills, roads, foods, etc. With scanty working wages and horrible working conditions, with very little safety precautions, high disease exposure, and consistent punishment, nearly 60% died before completing their contract. There was no real difference between slaving working conditions and the working conditions of the contract workers. In fact, they were even treated worse, for they were mere consumable rentals that were cheaper than a slave. Many were also tricked into signing, for they could not read, and the recruiters lied to them about the working conditions. The Chinese were also even lower on the racial hierarchy than a slave, because they were seen as alien. Despite all this, they still made up a quarter of the labor market by 1853. Then came the imports of 25 to 35,000 indigenous Mexicans, Jamaicans, and Bajans, and to preserve the white hierarchy, over 100,000 Spaniards before the end of slavery. Another preparation, a unique Cuban development, was the coartación, or in English, self-purchase. It gave slaves the opportunity to buy their own freedom to become a wage laborer. It's important to not mistake the sugarcrats' preparation and bourgeois-esque intellectualism with its willingness to submit to the world decree that ended slavery in 1886. Being the second to last slave society has to be acknowledged. While the sugarcrat had the understanding of expansion and sugar, the trauma of the Haitian Revolution loomed in their head. Freedom for black people meant a seizure of their property. They feared losing control, as well as they could not imagine a political and economic autonomy without slavery. Finally, despite its shortcomings, to the far more superior system, it was just still really profitable for the sugarcrats. With the abolishment of slavery, free worker imports continued, specifically with Spaniards, and the capitalist relations, already embedded, became overt. The Creole, no longer slave owners, became worthy of the title of the bourgeoisie. They complained of a labor shortage for decades and contributed largely to the import of workers. The Cuban bourgeoisie created a proletariat of their liking and enforced a racial hierarchy. Colonial ties loosened, though not gaining full independence nearly 20 years later. U.S. capital would soon dominate the island, defining the next 51 years of its history as a peripheral capitalist nation.
Yo pedí que lloviera para ti, Caña. Yo te he ayudado. Ayúdame tú a mí. Crece alta, muy alta, más alta que yo. Antes yo pensaba que en la vida lo peor era la muerte. Ahora sé que en la vida lo peor es la vida. Y tengo tanto miedo por mis hijos. Toda la vida me he pasado trabajando. Y toda la vida me he pasado en deudas. Crece, Caña, que no es para mí, es para ellos. ¿Me oyes? Crece, alta, muy alta.